name is Frances Marie Shoup Richardson, and I was born on Sunday, the 9th of July, 1933, in the old Cache Valley Hospital that's right across the street from the Tabernacle on First East. And my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was thrilled because she always wanted her first grandchild to be born on a Sunday for some reason. I don't know what that was. My parents are Marie Nettie Stoll Shoup and Stanley Bonner Shoup. My name, Frances, I think was spelled with an E, by the way. C-E-S. A man spells his, if he's Francis, is C-I-S. So it must have been a popular name in the 30s. In fact, one time we were in Portland, Oregon, going through the rose gardens and looking at all the rose queens that had been named over the years, and there were several young women whose name was Frances from those older days. So Marie is for my mother, and her mother, my Austrian grandmother, was named Maria. So that's several generations. I think some of our first daughter has Marie for her middle name, and several of the great-grandchildren have that name as well. So my mother was a stay-at-home mother until I guess my sister and I were in our teens. And my father worked repairing cars. His father at one time told him that he would pay for his college education, but my father declined the offer, unfortunately, and didn't take advantage of that. So he made sure that his daughters both did their college. So we lived in Logan for quite a while. My sister was born her name is Annette Mina Shoup Howard, and she, I don't know where Annette was from. It was probably another popular name. I think one of the quintuplets who was born in Canada was named Annette. Mina is for our paternal grandmother, Mina Short Shoup. And so we had a good time together, even though she was 3.5 years younger. She was born in Salt Lake, and my father, in those days, families couldn't go to visit their mothers when they had another baby. And so my father snuck me up the back stairs of the LDS hospital in Salt Lake so that I could see my mother. And in those days, mothers stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. So I was very happy to see my mother, I'm told. And I don't know whether I got to see my little sister at that time or not. But we lived in Salt Lake for a while, and then we lived in Richfield, Utah briefly, and then we moved back to Logan before I started kindergarten. So about that time, in kindergarten, I guess I was squinting or something, so my mother took me to the eye doctor to see if I had a problem. So I did. I was farsighted, and so I got little gold-rimmed glasses. And my good friend Camille Steed, who lived just through the back lot from us, thought they were so neat that she wanted to have a pair of glasses too. So she insisted that her mother would take her to the doctor. And unfortunately for her, she didn't have a problem, so she never got to wear eyeglasses. But anyway, so we lived in Salt Lake after my sister was born, and then came back to Logan. So I went to Logan schools, to the Wilson School in kindergarten and first grade. And then we moved to a different house, and I went to second grade at the Woodruff School. It was a brand new school in those days over close to Logan High. So that was good. Then my father and his father never really got along very well. And so my dad decided to move to greener pastures. So he went up to Portland, Oregon and found a job in a very nice automobile business. And then I don't remember exactly how later time it was that my mother and my sister and aunt and I believe we got on a bus, a Greyhound bus, and went to Portland and joined my dad. So at first up there we lived in Beaverton, and I went to the school there, and I went to third grade, and that was about in the summer of 1941, I think. So by December, World War II had broken out. I remember distinctly listening to the radio on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, and hearing that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. And that brought a lot of changes to our lives. And when I was at school, we lived only probably 2 blocks from the school. And so those of us who lived close to the school were assigned to have someone who lived farther away come home with us if there was an air raid. So we had practice air raid drills. And I remember taking my friend by the hand, and we went home to our house when we practiced that. Some of the other things that we did during the war were that if we drove the car at night, the car, by the way, was, I remember it distinctly, it was a 1937 gray Ford. And so anyway, we had ration stamps, and we would have different kinds of foods, the meat and so on. Sugar especially were rationed. There were stamps for gas, and there were stamps for liquor. For those, everybody got the same kind of stamps. So my dad would trade his liquor stamps. He didn't drink, so he'd trade them with someone who was willing to trade gas, petrol, or whatever. For my dad would trade his liquor stamps for gas stamps, and then we had enough stamps that we could even go out to the ocean occasionally. So that was interesting. Then, let's see, I mentioned, we also had to put up black curtains in addition to the curtains we had in our home, so that if any enemy airplanes came over Portland area, our lights from our homes wouldn't show. So we put darker curtains at the windows to keep the lights out, and if we drove, we had a kind of a dark blue cellophane we put over the car lights. So my dad at that time also changed jobs from working with the automobiles to working in the shipyards, and there were a number of shipyards, probably at least 7 or so in Portland, and he worked at Albina shipyards. And I remember that he occasionally would work on a Russian ship. We were friends with Russia at that time, so that if their ships had been damaged by the enemy, they would sometimes bring them into the harbor in Portland. Portland is on the Willamette River, and then it goes into the Columbia, and the Columbia goes out to the ocean. And so that was an interesting thing. For some reason, my father had always had an interest in Russia. And in fact, many, many years later, he was able to take a tour of Russia with a Utah State group. So anyway, he brought these men home, and I still have the paper where they wrote our names in Russian, and the Russian alphabet with A, and then the figure that they used for for their A's and so on. So that was an interesting part of our lives. We also, Portland didn't used to, another thing about the rationing, it was hard to get any rubber footwear, no rubber boots and so on. So we all wore wooden shoes to school. And I lived far enough away from the school that I was eligible to have a bicycle to ride. But rubber tires, those were things that were not available for people. Everything was going into the war effort. And so we were on a long waiting list. But I finally got a beautiful blue and white girls' bicycle to ride to school. And that was a delight. We purchased it at Meyer and Frank in Portland. So let's see, what else can I tell you about the war? It was a scary time, and but at the same time, it was a happy time because we were together. I remember that my little sister got pneumonia during the time that we lived in Portland, and she was very ill, but mother took care of her at home, and she recovered beautifully. And another time we had a huge deep snow. We have pictures of that snow, and probably 2 or 3 feet, and that was so unusual for Portland that it just shut down the whole city. But we all had a great time. So I had some really special friends there and some wonderful teachers. One of my teachers was, I think she was my 3rd or 4th grade teacher, and her name was Barbara Cady. And the favorite outfit that she wore that I liked so well was a brown skirt and a pink sweater, and then she had a shell necklace. And I just thought that was so lovely, and so I talked my into buying me a brown skirt and a pink sweater and a shell necklace, and then I was happy. One of my other teachers was Mrs. Clark, and she was from Scotland, and sometimes if we were really good in our class, she would do the Scottish fling or something, and she had like crossed swords, and she would dance on those, and it was a delight to watch her. She was a really sweet teacher. So my grandmother in Logan became very ill, my paternal grandmother, and so my father felt that he should go home to Logan to help his dad and to help look after his grandmother, or his mother, my grandmother. So when I was, just before I started 6th grade, we moved back to Logan, and my parents bought a home on First West. It's not there anymore. It actually was moved up to a lot by the middle school. And I went to the Ellis School for 6th grade, and I met some really lovely young people, and they've been lifelong friends, some of them. And so that was a treat. And my sister was in 2nd grade, and she still has friends now that she's almost 80, and she is still in touch with those friends. One of the things, it was suggested we tell about the games we played and so on, and we always had little kittens at our house, and that was a lot of fun. And my sister and I played dolls, and we taught school to our dolls. We each had a bedroom on the 2nd floor of our house, and so we played school. We put the dolls on the stairways, and then we were the teachers. We took turns being teachers, and we both graduated in elementary education when we got to school. But I'll tell you one more thing about what we did in our childhood. For some reason, Annette always had more money than I did. And so I somehow got this idea. I remember distinctly saying, well, Annette, let's divide our money. And she gave me the funniest look, and she wouldn't do it. And so I never got very rich as a child because she never would divide her money with me. Anyway, we babysat when we were in junior high, and I think I was the secretary of the seventh grade when I was in, it was junior high. It was up, it's just a parking lot now on First East, where the junior high was. So, but those were fun days, and my mother started working at that time, and she worked for a Singer sewing machine company that was on Main Street, and she taught lessons in doing sewing, and when people would come in and they'd need some help or so on, she would help them, and then she taught regular lessons, and she was a beautiful seamstress, and she made our clothes mostly. We bought our coats. I don't remember that she ever made a coat for us, but she did make most of our dresses, and she actually made my wedding dress, and it was a lovely dress made of lace, and it had little buttons, but that's getting way ahead of the story, I'm sure. But let's see, so what else can I tell you about our childhood? We always loved to go for a car ride in that. We still had that gray Ford. And so a lot of weekend afternoons on Saturday, we didn't usually do this, but sometimes on Sunday we would. But on Saturday, my dad always wanted to watch or listen. Of course, we didn't have television then. He wanted to listen to the Metropolitan Opera from New York. And so he would lie down on the couch, and everybody had to be quiet in the house so that he could hear those Metropolitan Opera broadcasts. So he actually, when he was in high school, had a very nice voice, and he was in several of the choruses while he was in high school. Let's see, where am I? So in junior high, I had a very fine teacher in 9th grade whose name was Mr. Gibbons, and he was the journalism teacher. And he was so nice to me. He always called me Shoup by my last name instead of my first name. But he gave me the opportunity to write a column for the the Emerald, I think it was called, the newspaper that we had in junior high. And later in life, when I was in high school, I met this friend. In fact, she and I were double dated with these two boys in high school. And I found out that she was Mr. Gibbons' daughter, Nanette Nelson, or she's Nanette Gibbons Nelson. And she's my lifelong friend. And I can see how she got to be so special because she had such a special dad. So then I went on to Logan High. At that time, the junior high, well, I think I told you where that was. So I went on to Logan High, and that was a lot of fun. I went into journalism there again, and was a feature editor at one time. And in those days, we had to go over to the Old Herald Journal office, which is on Center Street. It was about where there's a Bluebird candy company there now that has a shop, and that's where the Herald Journal office was, and that's where we printed the paper with, not with computers, but with those old keys and so on, and we had to proofread. They'd give us the copies and we'd proofread those and so on, and we had good times doing that. Being a journalist was a lot of fun. My physics class, I never did well in math and physics. I was passed with usually a B, or some in English and social studies I got A's, but I had a good friend, Winifred Loosley, who pulled me through physics. She always knew the answer. Harry Kemp was the teacher, and I thought he was really a hard teacher. But in social studies, I can't remember that teacher's name, but it was at the time that the UN was being formed. And so that's what we studied, how the UN was going to be formed. Of course, that was after the war was over. I was in 6th grade when the war ended in Logan. I remember all the horn honking and shouting and people walking down the streets and fire engines, sirens going on and so on. So anyway, in high school I was also on the debate team, and my partner was Janet Judah, and we were fast friends all through high school. Sometimes she'd go out with boys I wanted to go out with, or vice versa, but we were still friends. Boys weren't worth losing a good friendship like that. And we're still friends today. We saw her last spring in Provo and had a lovely visit. But one of the things that we debated every year, the National Debate Federation for high schools would send out a question that everybody in the United States was supposed to study about or debate about. And that was federal aid to education that year. So Mr. Johnson, the teacher, took us several teams down to a debate meet at Weber State, and none of us prepared to stay overnight because we didn't think we'd win any debates, but we all won our debates. And so we had to phone our parents and say, was it okay to stay overnight at Hotel Ben Lomond in Ogden? So that's what we did, and at least we got to the second day, and that was a lot of fun. Mr. Johnson was a fun teacher, and we always had this contest with him about whether the Brooklyn Dodgers was the best baseball team or the New York Giants. My friend and I were the Brooklyn Dodgers, and whoever won, and he was the New York Yankee fan. So whoever's team lost had to buy the other party a box of Bluebird chocolates. In those days, Bluebird chocolates cost $1 or $1.25 a box. Right now, I just sent a box to my sister a few weeks ago. I think they're $22 for a box of same size, a box of Bluebird chocolates. But one thing I didn't tell you about the Bluebird, I'll regress back to childhood. I don't think I mentioned this, but when I was in probably kindergarten, my mother and my little sister she was only 2, just barely walking. But on Saturday afternoon, she'd dress us up in these little navy blue capes that she'd made for us, and we each had a pair of white gloves. And we'd go walk up to the Bluebird from where we lived, and we would have ice cream at the counter in the Bluebird, and that was a special treat for us. Something that we remembered. Another thing about childhood that just crossed my mind was that we used to roll eggs down College Hill on Easter Sunday, and I have some fun pictures of us with another family on one Easter Sunday rolling eggs down. It's just on almost to the highway where the College Hill is. And it was interesting, our daughter's family, who lives in Logan, Stephanie's family, gave us a Wardle puzzle of Utah State campus. And for Christmas this year, which is a lot of years later, and there's a picture of some children rolling Easter eggs on that college campus in the puzzle. So I thought we weren't the only ones who did that. So anyway, we're in high school, and so we graduated from high school, and most of my friends and I went on to Utah State. And that was that was a major jump for us to go to college. And I needed to get a job to help pay for college. So in those days, the juvenile court was, it was held in a home, and it was just west of where the courthouse in Logan is now a home, and the probation officer and his family lived there. And that Charles, I've lost his name, Carlson, I think, and his wife lived there. And he was the probation officer. And I'd been taking shorthand. I know you probably don't know what shorthand is, because I've asked my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they have no clue what shorthand is. So it's a different way of writing. Secretaries used to always write in kind of a script. It probably looks like Arabic or something. That's the closest I can come to a description. So I was pretty good at that. So I could take shorthand and I could type, and which I learned in high school also. And in fact, my mother and I had the same teacher, Mr. Adams, for Logan High type. She, however many years ago that was, and I, in 1949, 50. So, so I got a job as the clerk of the juvenile court, and I actually started the job before I turned 18, because I was 17 in 1951 when I graduated from high school. I turned 18 that July. So that was a nice thing. So that was 3 hours a day. Every morning I went to the juvenile court, and on Wednesdays we had court, and the juvenile court judge from Ogden came up, and he was the one. Mostly we handled traffic cases or petty theft or something like that. Those were the things that kids did that weren't good. And it was handled in the living room of a home, because they didn't want juveniles to get the feeling of a real law court. So I had that job all through college, and it was a lot of fun. I was honored to become a member of Chi Omega sorority my freshman year, and I also became a sponsor at Utah State. And so I had a lot of things going on. And my friend LaRue Reading, who lived 2 houses away from us on First North, suggested to me that I run for freshman AWS, that's American Women's Association, or yeah, Associated Women's Students, that's what it is. It's no longer on campus. But that group was the kind of the headquarters for all the other women's groups, the women's athletics and the sororities and whatever women's students did. And so they all met together, and the Associated Women's Students were in charge of that. So that was a very nice thing for me, because the next year I ran for the sophomore representative, and the next year I was the president of the Associated Women's Students. So that was a great opportunity for me to get acquainted with not only my special friends that I'd had in high school and the ones who were in my sorority, but everybody, all women's students on campus. So I had some nice experiences, and a couple of, 3 actually, trips to different National Associated Women's Students conventions. So that was a nice thing. That's kind of how I met Gary. And he was active in student affairs, and he dated all the queens on campus. And I was dating a friend of his, and so we were together in a group a lot for a couple of years. And then I just decided that fellow that I was going with wasn't who I wanted to marry, and so we broke up. And that summer Gary had I can't remember whether he went to summer camp. I think that's what he did. So when he came home from summer camp, he called and wanted to know where his friend was. I said, oh, I haven't seen him for a long time. And he said, oh, what are you doing tonight? You know, don't mince words or beat around the bush, get right to the point sort of thing. So anyway, we started dating, and by that time I was into my third year at college, and Gary was student body president and I was associated women's president. So we were in a lot of meetings together. That was an interesting way to have a courtship. But we did a lot of fun things, and eventually he gave me his fraternity pin. That's what we did in the old days. I wore my sorority pin chained to his fraternity pin. And then at Christmas time, and that would have been 1953, he gave me my diamond, which I still have and still wear. And so we just had a lot of fun in college. It was really, and we did some hard things, and I think Gary told me that he told about some of the things, and when he told our children about that march on the Capitol and so on, one of our sons-in-law said, I didn't know you were such a rabble-rouser, Gary. So maybe that's what it was, I don't know. Anyway, we had a nice time and decided to get married in July. And Gary had finished college and he'd started work on a master's program. And I had my college finished except for my student teaching. So I didn't really want to give that up, but we didn't know exactly what to do. So we decided to get married and things would work out. And so we were married on the 19th of July, 1954. And that was it was a wonderful day. It was a happy, sad day for me because my parents couldn't go because my father was not a member of the church and had never joined. So we were married and we went on this funny honeymoon up to Jackson, and and I wore that beautiful dress that my mother made for me with the buttons from here all the way down, the little buttons. It was lace and had a lovely kind of Cinderella collar, and we were really nutty because we didn't have any money. I mean, I was the breadwinner. He got a little money for some lab work he was doing, but anyway, we went on this honeymoon, and I think he told you that we were towed from Preston because the water heater went out. Anyway, we did go to Jackson and Yellowstone, and we went to the Idaho Falls on the way and then came home. And we had that car for a long time. We got it fixed and it wasn't anything too serious. But anyway, when we got home from our honeymoon, we had been praying that either our orders for the Army, he'd finished ROTC and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. So he wanted to go on to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin. So when we got home, his orders were there to report to Fort Bliss, Texas in September, I believe it was. So that made our decision for us that we would do the 2 years that he had in the service, and then we would do graduate school after that. So I still had to figure out what I was going to do about my student teaching. So I went to the dean of the College of Education, E.A. Jacobson, and told him my dilemma. And we worked it out. So he contacted the Board of Education in El Paso, Texas, where Gary was assigned, and made arrangements for me to do student teaching in El Paso. And bless his heart, that was such a great blessing to me, because we went to Texas, and I got to do my student teaching in a third grade in, maybe it was second, in Ben Milan School. It was a quite new school, and it was lovely, and the teacher was so fine that she helped me a lot. And the only problem I had was when well, I'll tell you, they sang "The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You" every morning and had a prayer in Texas, and I just thought that was wonderful. And so it was getting to be close to Christmas time, and I said, well, let's make a mural on the bulletin board, and we'll have snowmen and we'll have sleds. And I was getting all these blank looks from these students, and I could not figure out what on earth was the problem. And so, come to find out, they'd never seen snow in Texas. They didn't know what I was talking about. And so I drew pictures and got pictures and showed them and so on. And we turned out a very fine snowy mural for Christmas. Anyway, I don't know whether that teacher graded me, how it worked, but I got the credit for doing my student teaching. So Gary had to be at Fort Bliss for about 3 months, and then he got his orders for where he was going to spend the rest of his 2 years, and we wanted to stay in the U.S. pretty much, because by that time I was expecting our first child, and his orders were for Germany, Kaiserslautern, Germany. So we packed up and went home to Logan, and I, for some reason, couldn't go with Gary right away. They didn't let dependents go right away for some reason. So he drove across the country to New York and put the car on a boat, and he flew to Kaiserslautern, Germany. Actually, it was to Frankfurt, and then someone picked him up there and took him to Kaiserslautern. So I stayed at home with my parents for until, let's see, May. And it was a very nervous time for me, because the Army wouldn't let you fly if you were more than 7 months pregnant. But finally I got my orders from San Francisco, and it was going to put me in Frankfurt just at the 7-month date. And so I flew to Salt Lake, much to my parents' dismay. I flew from Salt Lake to New York, and got a flight. And since I was traveling alone, they put me on Gary will be upset, I can't remember what these are called, but they were double-decker flight planes, but they still had propellers, 2 propellers on each side. And so I got to fly on that instead of in an Army plane to Germany. So it was a great flight. I guess it was the first time I'd ever been on an airplane. And Gary was there to meet me, and he didn't think I needed to go through customs, I guess, because he just ran up and gave me a big hug. And anyway, so we settled in officers' quarters, officers' apartments, or whatever they were called, 3 stories, 4 stories high, that the Germans had built. And we lived there for the rest of to fill out the rest of the 2 years. Our daughter was born in July 15th, 1955. So I was in the hospital on our wedding anniversary, our first wedding anniversary, and that was exciting. And they had rooming in, which was lovely, because they brought Linda, we named her Linda Marie. We brought her they brought her into a room, my room, so that she was right there beside me all the time. So since I wasn't going to have any help, I was glad to have her, hold her a few times before I took her home. Anyway, she was a delight from day one, and that my hospital bill was $7.50. So that pays to have your baby in the Army. But that was for my food, I think, as I recall. So anyway, if it hadn't been for the Relief Society sisters in that Kaiserslautern branch, I don't know whether I would have ever really survived, because they were so wonderful and they helped me so much. So, so we spent the rest of the 2 years in Kaiserslautern, and we traveled a little bit with Linda around the area. We went to Heidelberg sometimes on weekends and watched the fireworks. And we bought a Volkswagen at that time. Maybe Gary talked about that. I think we had to pay $1,100 for it because we had to get safety brakes and safety glass or something to take it back to the US. And we've been driving that other old Plymouth for a while, and Gary finally sold it and decided to get this Volkswagen. So we went to Holland, and when Linda was just a toddler, and then Gary and I, some sweet friends volunteered to take care of her when we were able to go to the Bern, Switzerland temple dedication. They had a special session for service people, and that was on the second or third day. That was September. And so that was a wonderful experience to do that. And so we, when Linda was just turning 1 year old, we had wanted to spend some time. I forgot to tell you this. When my uncle, my mother's sister's husband, Jim Doman, found out that we were going to Germany, he gave me a page this size with a pedigree chart on it. And it had my Austrian grandmother as the first person, and then her parents and back for, I think, about 4 generations. And he said, find your Austrian relatives. And so when we were in Austria, Gary could never get any time to take enough time to go to Austria or anywhere else except for those weekend things. So we finally did get time. So I should just backtrack and tell you that my mother's mother was from Austria. She came in 1906. She came on a ship from Belgium to New York City. I finally fairly recently, after computers, found her name on the Ellis Island records. So I have a picture of the ship and her on the manifest, her name and who her age and where she was going. And she happened to be traveling with 2 families that were from just across the Rhine River from where she lived. She lived in Hochst, Austria, and they lived in St. Margrethen. So she was traveling with those 2 families, and both of those 2 families were going to Logan, Utah. Her destination was New York City. So it finally came to me that she must have known about the gospel, and she must have decided that if she was going to belong to the church, she would have to be somewhere else besides there, because they were being persecuted. Let's just say it that way. And but she did have a brother who had gone to America before. So anyway, she was going to see someone in New York. But eventually she did get to the West, and she went to Manti, where one of these families was, and then she came to Logan, and that was where she met my grandfather, and they were married, and they had 5 children. When the youngest, my mother was the third child. My mother was the 3rd child. When the 5th child was about a month or so old in 1918, my grandmother died of the Spanish flu epidemic. And so from that time till the 50s, when I was where I was at that point, there was no contact. My grandfather didn't write in German or speak German, so he completely lost contact with my grandmother's family in Austria. So my uncle gave us this challenge to find these Austrian relatives. So in July, before we left to come home in September, Gary was able to get 2 weeks. So we took 2 weeks. We went to Paris and down to Rome, then to Venice and Florence and a couple of other places, and came up into southern Austria and to Hochst. And we said, so here we are in Hochst, how are we going to find my grandparents? So we went to the parish, and we found out that there were about 10% of the town were Schneiders. So that presented a problem. Which Schneider did we belong to? So they said, why don't you go talk to the school teacher? So the school teacher was just a short walk away, the school, and we went and found it was a Catholic school. All the teachers were priests. We found this young man who was out at recess with the students, and we told him that we were trying to find this Schneider family. And he said, if you'll just wait right here for 10 minutes, I'll be back. And he ran off. I don't know what happened to his students. But anyway, so he came back and he said, I went to see my auntie, who was a school teacher, and she knows which family your grandmother belongs to. And so they told us that they found for us an American, an English-speaking person who had come back from America to a funeral. And he went with us because Gary had picked up some German, but not probably enough to really have a good conversation. Anyway, this brother took us to the home, and we knocked on the door and said, we're your cousin, I'm your cousin from America. And the Hilda, it turned out to be, just squealed, and she said, oh, my cousine, and welcomed us in. And Joseph, who was actually my grandmother's brother, that was the father of Hilda. And so they welcomed us in, and we had dinner with them, and some other people kept coming and going. And at any rate, it has turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful relationship. When we first found them, there were still a lot of Schneiders, of my grandmothers, who were there, and the last of her first cousins just passed away this last year. And I've kept a list of who from my grandmother's family, her grandchildren and so on, and us, who have been there. And actually, the youngest child who was born just before my grandmother died, he and his wife have been to Austria several times, and some of them have come here. I have 3 typewritten pages of visits of some of us to them, or from some of them to us. And it's been a marvelous relationship. And we've learned so much, and I know some of them better than I know my own cousins who are here in America. So that's been a very special thing, and that was, I firmly believe that that's why we were sent to Germany for Gary to serve his Army time there. So we came home, we came to Utah to visit with our family, and then we went to Wisconsin in this Volkswagen with Linda, and Gary enrolled in school in the dairy science area in Madison, and we became members of a small branch that was located just across the street, and made some very special friends. We were there for 3 years, and Louise, our second daughter, was born in February 1957, and she was a delight, and so we had Linda and Louise, and we had just so much fun with them. And then we had Denise. She was born 2 years later, and she has been a delight as well. So we had these darling 3 little girls, and everybody was envious that we had such treasures. So Gary somehow has always had a love for music. Maybe he talked about that. I hope he did. But he's the only person in his department who ever went to the music department for a class. But he found out you could take music lessons for no charge. So he learned a lot, and he was in a new one-act opera that we had never heard of called Amal and the Night Visitors. He was one of the kings. And I remember taking those 3 little girls to that. You know, they were just little. They probably couldn't see over the seat in front of them, but to see that one-act opera, and it's been a treasure in all of our homes, all of the children's homes. And Gary said he told you that we prayed for 3 daughters and 3 sons, and I can't remember that we prayed for them, but I remember that we picked out names for them, and we ended up having 5 daughters and 1 son. And I've always said we had, it was lucky we only had 1 son, because I was a terrible den mother. I just never really thought I did a good job with Brian, I'm sorry to say, as a den mother anyway. So I was so blessed in Madison. They called me, I think it was the quote-unquote token graduate student. Those people, most of them were professors who lived in that branch, and they looked after the graduate students so well, and they'd invite us to Thanksgiving dinners, and they gave us furniture to set up our funny little apartments and all that sort of thing, and they were just friends forever. And the other graduate students, some of them have been friends forever, the Jerry and Lamar Anderson, and Stan and Shirley Kazare, and a number, the Morgans, Ruth and Dee Morgan. They just were so special, and we had 3 wonderful years there. Gary directed the Pirates of Penzance in the basement of the little chapel, and I was called to be the token counselor for I was the only graduate student in the presidency. Kay Tanner, and I can't think of what the other counselor's name were, and I. And that was a lovely opportunity to learn from those lovely women about how to be a Relief Society person. We did bazaars in those days and all that sort of thing. And we lived, the first year we lived in a funny little apartment in just outside of Madison. And we didn't have any furniture to speak of, but we just had a lot of stuff that we that people helped us. And the first time I washed diapers and hung them outside to dry, they didn't dry. And I couldn't figure out, why. And it finally dawned on me, the humidity is different in Madison with all those lakes than it is in Utah. So I had to get that figured out, to take longer to get the diapers dried. That was one one thing that was different. Then the next year we moved into a brand new apartment called Eagle Heights. It was much closer to the university and a lot of graduate students and some other members of our branch. So I've just been so blessed that I've not had to work outside of the home while we were raising our children. I've been grateful to Gary for his helping us to survive on what he made, and it did help to have the GI Bill. A lot of our friends didn't have the GI Bill, so the wives didn't have a choice but to work. But I was blessed with the GI Bill and the scholarship that he had, that we got by without my having to work. I did look after someone else's children occasionally, or I typed some theses. So we got through graduate school, and I ended up typing Gary's thesis. I think it's close to 100 pages, but I typed it on our little portable typewriter, 5 copies, 5 carbon copies. Now, that's not an easy feat. All you grandchildren who do everything at a click of the button, you wouldn't know what it was like to have 5 carbon copies. So I thought that was a pretty major accomplishment for me. Anyway, so Gary, we didn't want to move to a big city when he finished his PhD, and we ended up taking a job in Chicago. It wasn't New York, it was Chicago. So we lived in LaGrange, Illinois, actually a section of LaGrange called Hollywood. It's just south of the zoo, the Brookfield Zoo, and Linda started school there. And when I went for student conference with her teacher, who was a lovely young person, she said, you know, I try not to talk too much about television in class because I know Linda doesn't have a television at home. She said, is that because of your religion? And I said, no, it's just because we can't afford it. we don't think we need it. And so I guess that made her happy. But she was a lovely teacher, and Linda had a good experience there. And we all had a good experience there. It was nice to enjoy the plays and so on. And something I forgot when we were talking about being in the Army, I have this little booklet that Gary and I started. This is our first family night, Kaiserslautern, Germany, Sunday, February 5th, 1956. Gary presiding as chairman, Fran secretary. And so this is this little book that we started having family home evenings in. That was before Linda was born. And so we talked about setting Monday, number 4, Monday set aside for family home evenings. And it's been a blessing for us to have family home evenings. I have this little book, and that you can see the children wrote in that too. And when they got bigger, I have another bigger book that we kept minutes in of our lessons and activities and so on. And we've tried to do the right things. And our kids have all turned out so well. So that's probably one of the helpful things. I kind of feel sorry for our children because since I didn't get to really teach school after I received my bachelor's degree in elementary education, I taught them all. And so that's why they turned out so nicely, is because I gave all that education to them, those 6 children. So I hope you'll remember that, chicks. So anyway, so we went to Chicago, and that was a nice experience. And Gary served a stake mission there, and that was interesting and fun. And we loved the Brookfield Zoo, and we loved friends we made there. We were in a young marrieds group, and we had some good friends, the Wildings, and Dallin and June Oakes were in that group in West Suburban Ward. And we lived there 2.5 years, and then Gary had an opportunity to go up to back to Wisconsin to a place called Waukesha, and there was Dairyland Food Company. So we went up there, and that was Brian, our only son, was born in December, and we moved up there in January. And we decided we couldn't have a Volkswagen any longer when we had 4 children. So we got a green car that was bigger. I can't remember what kind it was. But anyway, but being in Waukesha provided us a lot of opportunities. And Linda and Louise started school, and they both did so well. Linda had the opportunity to be in The Sound of Music. She was the littlest child in the family, and that was fun. And Louise and, let's see, Denise, one of them became a brownie. I guess it was Louise. And they loved their little brother, and he was a delight. And they put him in, one time they put him in, he wasn't walking yet, their little doll stroller, and were strolling him around, and he fell forward and bumped his head, and we had to take him to the hospital and get him sewed up. Anyway, but they still loved him, and he was fun, and he just fit in really nicely with our family. And he got spoiled because he had to share a room with Denise for just a little while, but then after we moved to, well, Darcy was born in Waukesha also. And Darcy was she's our only brown-eyed child, and it was the most fun hospitalization I ever had, because she was, in those days we stayed in the hospital for 5 days. And there were 2 of us, and I knew this other girl, young woman, who had her baby daughter at about the same time I did. So we just had a good visit all the time, and if we didn't want to have visitors or anybody come in, we just shut the door and enjoyed ourselves. And it was April, and it was lovely, and the Relief Society sisters had a shower for her that they brought to our house in Wisconsin. And I was the Relief Society president. Can you imagine a pregnant Relief Society president in Wisconsin? So I had these 5 little children, and Darcy went to all of our meetings, our presidency meetings, and she would play under the table while we were meeting, and she grew up to be, I think she's been a Relief Society president 4 or 5 times. And I think she learned it all while I was serving as a Relief Society president. But anyway, then we were in Waukesha for quite a long time. And then Gary got a phone call from Burl Smith and Tony Erstrom in Logan. And they said, how would you like to come and teach at Utah State? And now that he'd been in industry for a few years, and he said, oh, that would be great. And so August of 1967, we bought a house, our first house that we purchased in Waukesha, and we sold that, or no, we didn't sell it, we left. And we stayed the night before we left with our good friends Bob and Libby Sellers, who we became friends with, who he and Gary were actually in competing businesses, more or less. But they were both in ADSA together, and his wife Libby and I were fast friends. She invited me to join AAUW, American Association of University Women, in Waukesha, and I got to know some other women in that area, and we've stayed good friends for all these years. And it was always fun to go to those meetings and see her again and some of the other ladies, and enjoy those opportunities. So we moved back to Logan, and we found a house on 1220 North, 1550 East, 1220 North. And it was built by Brother Nelson, and it was very lovely, and we bought that. And when we were there were no houses north of us. And now it's just, every lot is filled up, and I don't know how many wards there are, but it's a whole stake up there in that area now. So then we kept, all this time that we were having these babies, whenever we'd call home, my dad would have a fit that we'd had another baby or that we were going to. But we said we wanted 6 children in the beginning, and so I was getting older, and my dad was still there, and I thought, how can I be pregnant and have him telling me it's the wrong thing to do for 9 months? So anyway, finally we just said, okay. So we had another baby, and it was Stephanie. And my dad would come over and knock on the door and come in and, where's Stephanie? Steffenhagen. I think he called her Steffenhagen. Where's Steffenhagen? And so he just was thrilled with her. And his friends would tell us, your dad's always bragging about his grandchildren. And he was, but he never told us that he thought that they were all wonderful. But they grew up, and he was really pleased with them, and they used to go over, rotate, mowing his lawn and that sort of thing. And so he survived and we survived, and Stephanie's been a joy and a delight. But that's why she's 5 years younger than Darcy. But they're good friends too. So anyway, so now we've got all of our 6 children, and let's see, Ross Allen was the bishop when we first moved into that ward, and we made good friends. Elaine and Doug Alder were friends, and Kay and Alan Steed were friends, and there were just so many lovely people that we enjoyed being with. And so Gary was called to be on the High Council, and he was called to then he was called to be the bishop. And that was an interesting thing. And I said, well, where's the handbook for the bishop's wife? What is the bishop's wife supposed to do? So there never was a handbook for the bishop's wife, so I guess I figured it out, and I probably didn't do a very good job, but that brought us a lot of opportunities as well, and the children were busy and active, and the children, when Linda and Louise and maybe Denise were in high school, they all wore dresses to school. But by the time Stephanie got old enough to go to high school, they were wearing shorts and, just unbelievable kinds of things. And it changed so much over the years. It's just been interesting to see. But the children have all chosen wonderful companions. Linda married Pat Neely, and she had a lovely reception, and with her sisters in the line, and they've been blessed with 5 children. And J. Paul and Matthew and Daniel and Maria and Jessica and Louise married Darren Shaw, and they just chose not to have a reception, and they left in a cute little yellow car. And I said, okay, if you're going to kiss each other, pull over to the side. That was my advice I gave them. And they've been a delight, and they have Stacy and let's see, Justin and Jackie and Andrew. And then Denise found Rick Collister, and she was dating him when we were on our sabbatical leave in Ireland. And if she did, he had gone to the Y, and then he went to study abroad in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem Center. And if she didn't get a letter from him on a certain day, it was almost a catastrophe. And so anyway, they were married, and they had Stephen, excuse me, and Stephen and John and Michelle and Katie and Kimmy. And those three girls are all grandmothers now. And they've married, the ones who are married have married delightful people, and the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren are darling. So right now, and then Brian found this wonderful young woman, and I don't know how he was so bright to find her, but he did. And Carol, he's married to Carol Child, and they have Brad, who's married to Maddie, and they have Jill and Amy, and Colby is a senior in high school now. And I think I didn't name all the other grandchildren. Anyway, Darcy and James are married, and they have two of their children. Tasha and Nathan are married, and three are not, Joshua and Megan and Anna. And then Stephanie and Brent are married, and they have Kelly and, they have Kelly and Curtis, who's a thespian. He does tap dancing and etc. And Ella is 12. So we have 26 grandchildren, and I've made these little Afghans for the grandchildren. And so some of them received them as babies. They're a little different design. And some of them received them when they had their first child. And so that's been something. I think one of the things that it suggested we talk about is things that we've made. So these are knitted Afghans, and I've done, in fact, I used to knit argyles. I don't know whether you know what those are in college, but they're knitted socks, usually for men, in kind of a plaid design. I tried to knit some for Dad when we were dating, and I wanted it to be a surprise, and I kept looking at his feet, and they kept getting bigger. This sock kept getting bigger and bigger. So by the time I finished, it was kind of stuffed in the end of the toe. It was really too big. But he wore them a couple times just to please me. But we did that for a fundraiser in the sorority. I used to embroider pillowcases for a trousseau, and I know that you don't know what a trousseau is, most of you, because I've asked some of you. But that's another word, and maybe the other one, did I say shorthand? Do you know what shorthand is? Oh, we talked about that. Okay, there's another word you don't know. That's car hop. You don't know what car hop is, so trousseau and shorthand and car hops. And a car hop, I did that between my junior and senior year in high school at Steed's Dairy, and that's somebody who goes out. I think Maddox still has a car hop at their place. But you go out and take the orders, and then you bring the order out on a tray that fits onto the window of your driver's door usually. And so I did that for one summer to earn some money. And anyway, those three words you should know in case you're ever asked about it. But anyway, I've crocheted some things too, and I don't think, well, some of the children do those nowadays, some of the young people, but it's really a joy, and I guess I learned it from my mother because she was a good seamstress, and so I probably better should talk about something else now after we got everybody here, but just statistically, we had the 5 daughters and 1 son, and then we had 26 grandchildren, 12 grandsons, and who were all Eagle Scouts, by the way, and we have 14 granddaughters, so we have 26 grandchildren. So that means that I've knit 26 of these little Afghans. So, and now we have, I think we're expecting our 23rd great grandchild. So that's from just those 3 older sisters. So the rest of you remember that so you can catch up. Any rate, I do want to talk about our opportunity to serve in the Logan Temple. And we did that after, I should mention New Zealand though a little bit before I do that. Grandpa had 3 sabbatical leaves, and the first one was in New Zealand in 1967. After you work at the university for 6 or 7 or so years, you're entitled to take a leave to go study somewhere else or do something that will help you be a better professor. So he had this opportunity to go to New Zealand, and so he went. He was the bishop in the ward at the time, and he went to the stake president, brother whatever, can't think of his name right now, and he said, oh, of course you go, we have plenty of bishops in that ward. And he said, but you take your family. So we figured we could maybe afford to go for 6 months. So we took 6 children and went to New Zealand, and that was a wonderful adventure. And I think the children will all say that that was the best family thing we did, because we lived in a little small house. And the branch was so wonderful to us. Actually, the company, the group that Gary worked for or was working with, were supposed to find us a place to live, and when we arrived on the airplane, we didn't have a place to live. And so the branch president, Gary had written, and he also came to meet us at the airplane. And so he said, well, you can stay with us. And so 8 people, went to the branch president's home, and they got a caravan, they call it. It's like a trailer, a motor home or something. They brought one of those that somebody else owned, and so a couple of the children slept in that. So we were there about 3 days, and in the meantime we went to this real estate person, and he found us a place to live. It was not furnished. So this man brought us these funny pieces of furniture, but it worked out just fine. And the girls slept on, they call it, 2 of them slept on a lumpy bed. But they were, it was a good thing for us as a family, and I think we were a help in the branch there in Palmerston North, New Zealand. And in fact, the missionaries used to bring their investigators to our house for a family home evening, which we were still having. And we thought, oh, this can't be because we have 3 teenage daughters. But anyway, they would bring these people, and we had a good time with them. And Louise made a friend there. They helped with the musical programs. Linda and Louise played the organ, and they really did add a lot. And one of the missionaries wrote to us and said, maybe this was a mission for your family because you were good examples. So we really appreciated that. Linda went home at Christmas time, and Louise and Denise were able to participate in the first regional convention. It was held up we lived in Palmerston North, which is on the North Island, and this regional convention was up in wherever the temple is. And President Kimball was coming, and he wasn't in good health. And the young Maori boy who gave the opening prayer prayed that the prophet would be able to arrive. And at home, when we heard the other side of the story, or in the hotel where they were staying, President Kimball had been napping, and he woke up and he said, "Oh, isn't this time for us to go to the youth program?" And so he insisted on getting dressed, and he was there to see that program that the youth performed. And Louise was a Maori dancer. She got to wear the Maori costume and dance, and and Denise was a flower in one of the other numbers, and she had a pretty costume as well. So that was a special treat that we got in on while we were there. We also took 2 weeks and drove this funny car that we'd had. It was kind of a station wagon, but we could get everything in it, and we said, we're going to take these 2 weeks and go to the South Island. And so 2 people have to share a suitcase, because that's all that'll fit in the car. So they worked it out, and they did it, and we had a wonderful visit. We drove down the west side and around and back up, and loved the South Island of New Zealand. But we never saw a kiwi bird. So before we were going to leave in March, I said, we've got to see a kiwi bird before we leave. And the only one we could hear of was in the zoo in Wellington. So Gary didn't have time, so we had this Holden station wagon. He said, well, I'll drive down there. It was about 80 miles. And so I took the children, and we drove in that station wagon down to Wellington, looked at the kiwis in there. They had like a cave. They only come out at night, so they had this dark place that was lit enough so that we could see it. And so that was a real highlight to be in on the first regional conference. Now they have them when the temples are dedicated. And I don't know whether they even have regional conferences now, similar to that. Anyway, so that was our first. So by the time Gary had his second sabbatical leave, that was in Ireland, Cork, Ireland, in the south part. So we decided we would go, and we had 3 children left at home. Brian was on his mission and to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we had Denise, and that's when she was writing to Rick, and we had Darcy and Stephanie. So we went to Cork, Ireland, and that was a little tiny branch that met in the basement, or the lowest level of a house. And it was an experience, and it was cold, and it was raining, and it was depressing. And we still had good friends, and we rented this car that we kept. And well, the thing is, we went to church, and when we came home on the bus, we still had 2 or 3 blocks to walk to our apartment. And we were all drenched to the skin, so we said, we guess we better make arrangements for a car. So we rented a car for the rest of the time that we were there, and we had some adventures going to Irish castles and to Dublin, and it was just a real fine experience for us. So the third sabbatical leave that we took was to England, to York, England, and that was for 4 months, I think. And the company that Gary did this sabbatical with gave us a car to use. And so we loved that, and every weekend we would go. At first we started out and we said, well, we can't go anywhere this weekend because it's raining. Well, it rained every weekend, we found out. So we just went and got wet and enjoyed it, and that was fun. But we just had, Stephanie was the only one left at home. The others were married by that time. So Stephanie was a good sport. She was 16 and she had these two parents to deal with. So again, the church saved our lives, and she had met a wonderful family, the branch president's family. Amy Bridgestock was the friend that was her age, and they just hit it off, and Amy saved Stephanie's life. And they would go to Mutual, and we would take them, or they would arrange for a ride for Stephanie or something. Anyway, it worked out really well, and those girls are, Stephanie actually went back to England when Amy was married in the London Temple, and that was lovely. Amy came once to our house before she was married in the US, and Stephanie took her to the university, and she looked around, and it was at the time, there you probably don't remember, but there was a show called Dallas, and it was these rich Texans, oil people, and they all had big cars. So Amy got out of the car, and of course they show these lovely things in all over the world. So Amy had watched them in England, and so she went to the university and she looked around and she said, well, where are all the big cars? And so we had to explain everybody doesn't live like they do in Dallas. So anyway, and then just recently, this year, 2016, last year, Stephanie had the opportunity to go over there and see Amy again. That was a lovely opportunity. So, so we've had 3 sabbaticals. So then we worked in the temple after Gary retired, and he was about 60 when he retired. So we worked in the temple for about 3 years as officiators, and that was a joy and a delight, and we were so thrilled. And we hadn't really thought a lot about serving a mission as couples. We thought that was adequate to be working in the temple. At that time, you were called to work for 2 days a week or 2 sessions a week. So we went at 6 o'clock and finished around 10. Or we went actually, I guess, at about 4:30 or 5. But anyway, so that was a wonderful thing to do. So we were down at Thanksgiving time at Darcy's in Texas visiting, and in those days sometimes they would advertise if they had a special mission or needed a special person in the church offices or something. They would advertise, and so we looked, and they needed some teachers in Samoa. Well, we thought, that would be kind of an interesting thing to do. So we applied and were accepted. They said, yes, you qualify. So we got our call to serve in the Apia Samoan mission as a CES, Church Education System, missionaries. So I was so thrilled because, I put off being a formal teacher for a long time while my children grew up and did their thing. By the way, they all 6 graduated from Utah State. And Brian went on and got his, after he and Carol were married and he was working in Salt Lake, he got his MBA at the University of Utah. So that's been wonderful for them and for us to see their progress. So I thought, well, that'll give me an opportunity to teach. And But actually, when we got to Samoa, Gary had plenty of work to do teaching the upper classes, the older ones. It's called CES, or it's called, let's see, anyway, it's like a high school. It's called the Church College of Hawaii, of Samoa, but it's really like a high school. And so he was teaching the chemistry and math and physics and that sort of thing. And I said, well, what will I be doing? And they said, well, we'll find for you to do. So we went over there, and there was nothing really. I thought I could teach in the elementary school. They had a wonderful elementary school. But it turns out those Samoan ladies didn't want any English ladies teaching their students English. They wanted to keep doing it the way they'd been doing it forever. And so we were only supposed to speak English to the students. We didn't. So we had to work with them no matter what level they were on. So Dan Anderson he'd been, I think, president of BYU in Hawaii. And he was the country director, and he came to me one day and he said, do you think you could handle a year 10 English class? And I said, well, I'd be glad to try. So I went to the lady who was the department head of English, and I said, now, which book should I use? And she took me to where they kept their books, and she said, just use whatever you want. So there was no curriculum for me to follow. So fortunately, there was another woman from North Ogden who was teaching, who had been a real 9th grade teacher. So she helped me a lot, choose which books to. So that first year I had 3 classes of students, and about 25 or so in each class. And as I got to know them, they didn't really know a lot of English. But I had only English books, and I didn't know Samoan, and I was supposed to be teaching in English. So that presented a lot of problems. Well, I shouldn't say problems, I should say challenges. So I decided, then the second year, Dan Anderson asked me to teach 5 classes. So I taught 5 classes. So in those 5 classes, probably only 1 class was up to the level that a U.S. school would be. And so I, again, just kind of worked out my own formula, and I had wonderful experiences and met wonderful students, and it was an absolutely delight. And I felt like at last I'm a real teacher in a real classroom. And they were so sweet, and one of the girls, I decided the best way to teach was to help them read better. So we worked on books, and if we paid our own way, we could go home at the break at Christmas. So we did that, and I brought a suitcase of paperback books for young people. And I said, just take these home and read these books, and then bring them back, and somebody else can take them home. So that was the general idea. So when I was trying to gather those up to go home, or to see how many were left, then they'd say, well, the dog ate my book, or I let my cousin borrow that book, or so those books all just disappeared into the woods, into the jungle. Anyway, but when we drove around the island and saw how they lived, most of them, they were just living. They have the cement floors, and then they just have the thatched roofs, and they don't have real homes. They don't have desks in their homes or a place to read or study or anything like that. So I just quit worrying about it and let those books go wherever they could. I was happy to share them. But it was a wonderful experience for me. And I got very close to some of the young people. So anyway, Gary and I served there for 2 years. Then we went back to the temple when we came home and served again and loved that again. And then I can't remember exactly how it came up. Maybe it was another ad in the church news, but the BYU Hawaii was in need of a chemistry teacher. And Gary said, well, how about that? So that was the year 2000. So, well, it was 1999 actually when we put in our papers. So we went down and talked to the people in the church education system and said, well, we'd like to do that and so on. And so we went to BYU Hawaii. And that was very interesting because they didn't really have anybody who looked after the missionaries. So the missionaries kind of looked after themselves, each other. And we did have a van. They gave us a van for 3 couples to use and so on. So that worked out. And the other missionaries. And so I began to realize they called the husbands and then the wives were kind of on their own. So the one who was in charge of us, the professor at the university, said, well, Sister Richardson, just go look around and see what you can find to do. And so one of the sisters found an opportunity to serve in the library, and someone else did some other thing. Well, there were a couple who were homemaking, but I couldn't do that. They were wonderful, and I'm glad to know them. Sister Peterson made pulatasis, the skirts and the tops for every couple, or for the sisters, and then a matching shirt for the men. So anyway, that turned out to be, so what I turned out to do at BYU Hawaii, I finally went to the English department. That English had been one of my minors. So I asked if they needed any help. Well, they could use me as a English as a second language tutor. So I said, oh, that'll be fine. I'd love to do that. So they explained how the teachers would give the students, they're supposed to be able to read English and speak pretty well, the students, when they come to BYU Hawaii. Some of them could and some of them had problems. So the teachers would assign these students to come. There were 3 or 4 of us who did that, sister missionaries. And so I got my assignment, and then they kept adding more, and the teachers would assign a movie or a book sometimes and have the student read that, and then they'd tell me what they read, and we'd talk about what they read and that sort of thing, so that so that's what I did for a year and a half, and that turned out to be wonderful. And while we were there at BYU Hawaii, we ran into a couple of people who we taught in Samoa. And that was such a blessing to see that those kids had actually done well enough that they could be accepted at BYU. And Seville was a sweetheart. Gary worked with her a little on a science project, but she was in one of my English classes. And I was so happy to find her, and we found a couple of others. And we, anyway, Seville was, she met this returned missionary, a Palangi, or a white person. And he served in the islands, so he knew the Polynesian culture pretty well. So I said, I didn't know him, and I said, Seville, your parents aren't here. Bring him to our house, will you? So we can meet him and see what we think. So anyway, she brought James to our house, and we decided he was okay. He was really a nice young man. So they were married while we were there, and it was just her mother came from Samoa, and they actually just came this last summer they live in New Mexico, and I got this phone call, and she said, Sister Richardson, this is Savilli. We're going to James's sisters in Rexburg. Could we stop and visit you on the way? And it was a delightful, delightful visit. And our youngest daughter came to lunch with us there at our house, and Savilli just said, oh, your mother was just so wonderful. And I just thought, oh, you sweet girl. Anyway, that was a real reward all these years later. So those were our two missions, to Samoa and to BYU, Hawaii, where we met more Samoan young people, and we met so many wonderful people. I had 2 of my students that I tutored were baptized. One was a young woman from China. She had been the BYU Hawaii sent people over to get acquainted with Hawaiians so that they could take their musical shows and so on to China. And Amy decided to come to BYU Hawaii. And when it wasn't really my job to teach her the gospel, but they found out, the temple president found out that we had worked in the Logan temple. So he said, could you just come one night a week? So we went to helped at the Hawaiian temple one night a week for the time that we were there, 1.5 years. And so I lost my train of thought. Anyway, it was I'm just a blank. Anyway. Okay, so Amy, one night we got home from the temple on a Friday night, and there was a message. And it was Amy, and she said, Sister Richardson, I'm going to be baptized tomorrow. Could you give this baptism talk? And that was it. And so it wasn't on I didn't have a cell phone in those days. And so I didn't know how to call her back or anything. So I don't know, maybe she called me back. Anyway, so I did go. And when I got to the baptism, the other speaker was the president of BYU Hawaii. So I was very nervous, but I did speak, and it was a lovely thing. She was a lovely girl, and she was very nervous about becoming a member, but as I understand now, Chinese people are, our oldest daughter and her husband just came back from a mission in London, and they are baptizing people right and left, Chinese people. And so I hope Amy is very happy still as a member of the church. The other was a young man who wanted to be baptized in the ocean, and he didn't invite me to speak, thank goodness, but he invited us to come to his baptism. And I don't know how he learned the gospel, but I was honored. We were honored. We went to his baptism in the ocean just across from the campus there. Anyway, so Gary and I, after we finished that, we went back to the temple. I remember one of the things on the list of what to talk about was what we've done in the church. We've always had a responsibility. I was the Relief Society president when we lived in Waukesha. I mentioned that. And here in Logan, I was, when we were in Samoa, I thought one day to myself, I wonder what responsibility I'll be given when we get home. And it just popped into my mind, you'll be the Stake Relief Society president. And I thought, oh, that's ridiculous. I would never do that in Logan with all these people. And so lo and behold, not too long after we returned to Logan, I was called to be the Stake Relief Society president. So that was a wonderful opportunity. it was just an amazing opportunity. I was on the board, I guess, before we went to Samoa, and I had worked with people, but I felt so blessed because there were some older women who were so much more experienced than I was. And I remember Sister Shoup in the 5th Ward, and she was called to be the Ward Relief Society when she was 80 years old, and she was a widow, and I was supposed to go train her. And I thought, what can I ever say to this woman who, I just let her talk and she trained me. Anyway, it was a wonderful opportunity. And then I was called again to be a Stake Relief Society president to the university when they just had 3 stakes. They had 1 married and 2 single stakes. And I served with President Sampson, who was a delightful, delightful person to work with. And I had wonderful counselors, and I was there almost 4 years. And there was such a turnover of young women. I trained, I don't know why I started keeping track of this, trained or oriented to the position of Ward Relief Society president, 40 women, young women in that 4-year period of time. And the two of my counselors were Barbara Child. She was Barbara Bassett, and she had been on a mission to Italy, one of the few young women at that time, but she was the Ward Relief Society president. So I lost my one counselor, and I called Barbara to be my counselor, and then I called Betty Neely, it was education counselor. I called Betty Neely to be the homemaking counselor, and Barbara Child, the education counselor, and that was a wonderful opportunity to serve those young women. And I learned that they function differently than somebody at my age. I learned that they can put something together on a moment's notice that's going to be better than anything I could do if I spent a week working on it. And so it was a very heartwarming experience. It turns out right now we live in the ward with both of those women, Barbara Child and Betty Neely. Betty Neely is actually my daughter's mother-in-law. But those 2 opportunities to serve the women of the church were very blessed to me, and I came to realize that Heavenly Father loves His daughters. He knows who we are and what we need and what we should be doing and how to do it. He tells us if we'll listen. So I've just been so very blessed. I haven't talked enough about Gary, how he supported me in doing so many things that he probably thought were really weird. But he's been a wonderful support to me. We've had family home meetings with the children all of our lives. We've tried to be at their important occasions, but I don't know whether we're doing that very well anymore because we're not driving and that sort of thing. Anyway, I think I'm running out of what to say, but I'm just so grateful for the gospel and for the blessings that we've received as individuals and as a family. And I'm so grateful for our children, that they are faithful and that they probably live better lives than I do. And they're good examples to us now as we're growing older, and they're very kind and thoughtful to us, and we've been grateful for everything that Heavenly Father has seen fit to bless us with, especially for each other, and for the opportunities to serve that we've been given. They're are very unusual probably for somebody with my background, because a lot of people that I admire just grew up in the church and so on. But I guess I grew up in the church, but I didn't have a really active, supporting, complete family. Anyway, it's been a delight. We've been so blessed with our children and grandchildren, and we're so proud of them. Since they changed the girls' age of missionaries to 18 or 19, I mean, we've had all of our granddaughters serve missions. We had 4 granddaughters out at one time, and we've had 3 daughters in different missions in Texas, 2 Spanish and 1, and 2 of them got to see each other at one point, and they were so thrilled and delighted. Anyway, I think I'll just express my gratitude to Heavenly Father for blessing us so much in our family, and pray that will help us to endure to the end and be worthy of all the things that we enjoy and the plan that He has given us to raise our children. We would have probably been failures if we hadn't had the guidance of the prophets and listened to conference and gone to church as much all the time, and family home evenings and so on. And I'm grateful for every single person in the family, and I'm sorry if I didn't name all of you. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.